Welcome everyone to another installment of our Ask the Editor series. I'm thrilled to be here today with Jenn Scheck-Kahn, founder of Journal of the Month. Hi Jenn, how are you?
Good. I'm doing well, thanks.
Wonderful. Jenn is not a Lit Mag editor, but her endeavor is awesome. And it is, it's a very exciting entrepreneurial literary project. So today we're going to talk all about what she does and why, and what writers can learn from literary magazines. So Jenn, let's jump right in. Tell us when you started Journal of the Month and why you started. And tell us what it is first, actually.
Sure. Journal of the Month, which has a website of journalofthemonth.com conveniently, is a service for writers where writers can sign up to get a different current print literary journal in the mail on a regular basis. So you know which journals participate in our group. There's about 36 of them. All of them were vetted by me. But you don't know what you're going to get when. So the sort of surprise of it is what is exciting. And the idea behind it is that we want to introduce you to a wide variety of quality literary journals that are being published in the United States. And this is a way to kind of throw yourself in and learn about them. And so how I started Journal of the Month, I will try to keep this brief. But I started mostly when I finished graduate school. I wanted to get a sense for what was being published in print journals. Many print journals now have online components, but many of them, the online journal is separate from the content that's in the print journal. It's not the case for all of them. Some are print journal and they'll have some selections from that, and that's what their online journal is, but some are totally different personalities. So I was very interested in just going to a bookstore, sitting around, reading through literary journals and figuring out, what do I like? What's important to me? What do I want to influence my work? And where do I want to eventually see my work being published? And that used to be a thing that you could do very easily, with bookstores. But now it's really, most bookstores just have regional journals. So the journals that are published within your region, or the really big names, across the country. But there are over 600 in print. And so it's hard to get a sense for what's out there. So I was like, I don't want to subscribe to one. I want to subscribe to them all. How do I do this? And so that's where I came up with Journal of the Month.
That's great. So you mentioned the 36 magazines are all vetted by you. How do you choose those magazines?
Oh, it's so interesting. I read the journal and decide if I like it now, and which is an interesting question, I think, to pose to writers too. Like, how do you decide what you like?
Yeah.
You're never going to like 100% of what's in the journal, and I think if I like 60, 75% of what's in the journal, and I think it's an important voice, then I will invite the journal to join. In the beginning, when I was first coming up with Journal of the Month, I just went to AWP and I would go from table to table and just say hi, you don't know me, but I'm going to judge your journal. And if you will give me a free copy, I will judge it and decide if I think it's worthy, which is a very awkward position to be in as a writer, because you're like, oh, and I also am a writer.
Right.
Perhaps to publish my work at some point, and I also felt very, a strange sense of hubris. Who am I to be making these decisions? I'm like many MFA graduates, opinionated and hoping to change the world. But yeah, and the oddest part is then, once journals found out about what I was doing, I continue to be bombarded by journals, international journals in the United States. Like I have my list of my bookshelf of the journals that I get sent, to reread. And honestly, it's the thing I spend the least amount of time doing. So if I can add 1 or 2 journals a year, that's amazing. But many years I can't. And then I'm also put in this strange position of turning down journals. And
right.
I don't think you're adding to what I'm trying to do, which is, again, very, very awkward, but also sort of empowering. And I think an important lesson to writers that you have an idea, you may not be a big name, but you follow that idea and see where it leads you, because we all, we're all in this and trying to change and influence this world in a variety of ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. That was a similar position when I was doing the review, where I was in a position of reviewing these literary magazines, and also, like you said, empowering other writers to make those decisions for themselves and actually realize I've been treasuring this magazine for so long, but I've never actually read it. And now that I'm reading it, is it a magazine I actually want to see my work in? And I think that's really important for writers.
Absolutely.
So do you ever come across a magazine that you know is like prestigious or top tier, but that you have decided that it's not right for your program?
I would say, because I am not adding a lot of journals all the
Mm,
time, that the ones that are, there are journals I've asked not to,
mm,
I've not invited into the program. Are they top tier journals? I guess it depends on how you
right.
sort of define that. But yeah, yeah. So I guess I would say probably mid tier that I've not
Mhm,
invited, but
mhm.
yeah.
Interesting. And also, I forgot to mention at the beginning, if you guys have questions, just go ahead and type them into the chat and we will just work them into the conversation.
Something else I should add too is that after Journal of the Month has been around for 10 years now.
Mhm.
I started when my daughter was almost 1.
Wow.
Yeah. I was pregnant with my second one, which may have influenced, shifted my trajectory a little bit. But I and actually we've, over these 10 years, we've distributed over 19,000 literary magazines.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been, and we, in part through, people signing up and just saying like, yes, I want to receive, one journal every 4 months for a year to try out, but also because I run a classroom program and one of my instructors is on this call that I see. It's very exciting for me because I've never met her face to face, or not since we've been working, as closely as we have the past few years. But in any case, I run a classroom program. We're mostly, university instructors. Some are, teach graduate students, some undergrad, some, associates programs, a couple high school teachers, but they use our literary magazines in the classroom, and
Mhm,
students will sign up to get them.
mhm,
And also editors are available for video conference interviews too. So it's kind of a nice way to get in deep and
mhm,
educate your students, either use the literary journals as a primary text, for the craft discussions you have, or as a discussion on production, how do you
mhm.
create a literary magazine?
It's such a cool program because it's a rotating cast of lit mags. And I think writers feel like that's what you need, right? You need to have this overview of the lit mag landscape. And this is really the only thing like it, if I'm not mistaken, where you can subscribe and just get different magazines. So you don't have to lock yourself into the one magazine.
Yeah, I think that's exciting for instructors, but it's
Mhm.
certainly, particularly who want to, teach a variety of work and not kind of, and also be feeding their own writing, right? There,
Mhm.
I can see being a writing instructor. I teach occasionally, but not, as a semester-long class. But I can imagine, you teach the same stuff. It's not as feeding to your own work and your own
Right.
institution, both
Right.
as a teacher and as a writer. So I think bringing in new literary magazines, but it's a little tricky because you're like, all right, I'm going to be teaching something I haven't yet received. I just have to have faith that the lessons that I am, intending will be visible, within these.
Right.
So it's
Right.
not for everyone, but I feel like there's some people like Jenna who've been in the program for a long time and just feels like that's just how they teach now.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So you mentioned having little kids, and actually, I didn't realize you started this when your kids were so young. That's pretty amazing. So how do you do it? I mean, what keeps you, so you're a writer, you're a fiction or nonfiction writer. You're also sending your work out for publication, teaching occasionally, and the mom of very young children. And so how do you manage to maintain this literary side project?
Not well. I don't know. I mean, I can say that when I first started it, I had really big ideas about how I was going to build it and grow it.
Mhm,
In part, I think it was a real lifeline for me when my kids were young, because
mm,
I felt, I'm this sort of writer. I don't know if you're this way, Becky, but like when I start writing, I admire these writers who are like, I can just do it for 15 minutes a day, or, I just squeeze it in. I'm someone who I want many hours. And if
mm,
I have to interrupt and I can't stop at a natural endpoint, like I miss pickup, I miss other things. I'm
mm,
really cranky because I'm like, my brain's in this. I don't want to have to shift and pull out of that flow,
mhm,
So for a long time, I wasn't writing. I stopped writing when my kids were young.
Mm.
And so Journal of the Month was a real lifeline for me into the writing world. And I felt like it kept me engaged, it kept me involved. It was really nice to I had these very solid, clearly defined tasks that I could do. And which when your kids are young and you're like, I don't know if I can shower, but I can spend half an hour responding to emails and, so I feel like it really kept me engaged and involved when they were young. And now I think it's, the pandemic has been particularly challenging. I feel like there's sort of these two kinds of writers during the pandemic. There's like the writers who really just had the time and threw themselves into it and they're submitting and publishing. And then there are the writers who I feel like me and perhaps like you, who are envious and perhaps disingenuous about those writers, or just, oh my gosh, I wish I had that time because the pandemic just cut my life even smaller, with my kids home. And
right, of course.
So, and in the clarity of mind to really be thinking about writing. So it's definitely been a challenge, I think, over these years. And additionally, as I've, I would see Journal of the Month as advocacy work that I do for the writing community. And I've always felt that as a writer, right, we were inspired to write because we were influenced by the writers who came before us, right? And they changed us, and we want to change the writers who come after us, right? And that's how we participate in this world. And partly we do it through writing, but we also do it through reading and supporting other writers. And Becky and I first met each other at Grub Street, which is a writing center in Boston. And I used to work there as a volunteer. I would unlock it, right? I feel like that's a really important way to think about what are the many ways that I can support other writers and the writing world. So that's sort of how, Journal of the Month really felt like an advocacy project for me. Although now my kids are older, and actually I have other advocacy work that I'm doing that is actually a little more primary, in my life as well. So,
Yeah, I relate to that so completely, because you want something, it's not like the high level concentration work of writing where you need to shut out the rest of the world, but it keeps you in the literary world. It keeps you reading stuff that you might not necessarily read otherwise. And it just keeps you in the game while you're doing juggling all these other things.
And I also think, one of the questions that I think people sort of have asked me is so you work with these journals, do they publish your work? How does that directly come back to you? And of the journals I work with, I have one journal that's published me, but none of the rest of them have. So it hasn't been a direct connection to publication in that way. But because of my relationships with editors and my engagement in this world, I'm invited to do, lead panels. And there's one panel that I led at Grub Street in 2017 that actually led to a couple of things that I wrote that came out of it. And those led to publications. those were more critical pieces particularly about race equity in the writing world. And but I was able to get an article, on the subject published in Poets and Writers. And then I moderated a conversation that was then published in Creative Nonfiction based on that experience. So it's sort of a long tail for publication. And I think really, rather than seeing it directly as you do this work to support literary magazines, how do you get published? But really, you do this work to engage more deeply in a community that you believe in. And that leads, to it's generative.
Absolutely. And I think we have a question here, which I'll get to in a second, but that just made me think, one thing that I think is really useful about this is that neither one of us are professors. We're not in academia. And I think it's really useful for writers to know that there are other paths that can be pursued. Because academia, it's really hard. It's a wonderful path if you want to pursue that path, but it's so demanding and competitive. And if it's not right for you, there are other avenues to pursue. And I love what you're saying, because it sort of speaks to the hustle of all of it, right? You're going to be on a panel and this is going to lead, and that's how your brain is working, right? It's constantly spinning and this thing is going to lead to this thing. And but it's fun and it's exciting, and you're sort of making you're your own boss, as they say. So that's kind of empowering. And it's great for writers to know that there are other ways that you can be in this world and in this community without necessarily pursuing the kind of adjunct path, the academia path, which can be just really intense and hard.
I'd also say, to add to that too, that sometimes some of the work that you put in, like you don't know what the effect is. I had this experience that I organized this, there's like this lit week that happened in Boston, and I was like, all right, I'm going to organize something and try to get the Journal of the Month name out there. And I put together this Journal of the Month Mad Libs, and I came up with like really well-known texts, and it was so funny. And I was like, this is going to be great. And so, I had this bar that we were going to do it at, and I, printed out my hundreds of copies, right? Because so many people are going to come. And then no one came.
Oh no.
It was like me and like two friends, and then like one friend's like boyfriend or something, no one showed up. But then like 2 weeks later, someone from the Boston Globe got in touch with me and was like, oh, I've heard of Journal of the Month. And clearly they heard about it, and clearly they did not attend. Writing a little something, about what I was doing. And I just thought, like, oh yeah, you put it out there, and you don't know what's going to come back.
Yeah. And it's sort of like the business person's mentality, which is sometimes refreshing to step into. Because I know, like, with my trial and error, with my craft, with my writing, I take that very seriously, and I get really frustrated when things aren't working. If I'm trying to pull off a scene and it's just not working. But it's good to remember to slip into that other part of your brain that's just like water off a duck's back. You try one thing, you try another thing, you just keep trying things. And I find that with my own literary side projects, I have more of that freedom and that playfulness, and I want to apply that to my so just in terms of like how your writing can improve from these literary side projects. I think it's an important lesson, right? That you try things and you don't take it personally. You don't take rejection too seriously. Don't take it too hard. You just keep trying lots of new things. And so we have a question here from Anne. Thanks. I know of someone who tunes her writing to what a journal publishes. She has fabulous pub credentials, but I view it as a bit of a sellout for all that my pub. Okay, so how does a writer thread that? That's a great question. How does a writer thread that needle, sort of writing this? I think this is the question, like writing true to yourself, staying true to yourself, and writing what you want to be writing versus sort of pandering to the market. I think that's a question writers think about generally, like with lit mags or with more commercial publishing. How do you sort of stay true to your own vision while maybe also trying to get your work published? Jenn, do you want to tackle that?
I have a lot of thoughts about that question. Thanks, Anne. My first thought is we all handle rejection differently, and we all have different amounts of tolerance for rejection. And I know personally my tolerance has changed as I've gotten older. When I was younger in graduate school, I would get a rejection. I'd be like, you think you're special? Everyone rejects me. I'm coming back, and I just had this real like tough, hard edge. And now it lands much harder, honestly. And so I think we need to sort of know going into it how much you can take, and then how you make those decisions based on that. If you know that it's hard for you to manage rejection, I think taking this approach, this really practical approach of what's more important to me is to see my work, and to be part of these certain magazines, then I think it's very wise to read those magazines, figure out what they're publishing, and to write to it. I personally did something similarly with a certain a column that I was like, I really love this column. I kind of want to break it and see how does this work, and what is their, what are they really into? But that, so that's one kind of writing. And then, the other kind of writing is you write what is most important to you, and then you find your audience out there. Not everyone has that luxury and the time to do that, as well. But I think, in an ideal world, that's what we would all do, right? Yeah, but I think, but the wonderful thing as a writer is that we're constantly reinventing ourselves, right? Everything you write is reinventing yourself. And until you are like Stephen King and you have a formula and like this name, like the beauty of being an emerging writer is you can be different kinds of writers on different days. So maybe today, this is something that I'm like I wanted to find a mainstream audience. So I'm going to try to write it in a way that will appeal to a mainstream audience. Now here's something else that like, this is my heart, writing, and I'm going to do that elsewhere. I mean, I find I'm writing my degrees in fiction, but I'm writing more creative nonfiction, which is I think even more, different from like the poetry world and even the fiction world, because there is a paying market. Like you can get your work and a bigger audience, if you write it a certain way, as opposed to, a more straightforward way. If you write it in a more literary way, then you're going the lit mag route, and there's less money and less prestige, but you sort of make that decision as the material requires.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think there's really no right way to do it. I mean, you have to know what kind of writer you are. I don't think if you write something in order to get published, I wouldn't call that selling out, especially if it's for a lit mag, because you're not selling out if it's going to be in a lit mag. But I think many writers can't do that. You have one thing that you write. It's conventionally structured short stories with beautifully rich, complex characters, and that's your thing. That's what you do, and you're trying to perfect it, and you're trying to do it really well, and that's all you can do. And I think that's great, as long as you're writing. And other writers say, oh, this magazine has a flash fiction contest, and this magazine wants stuff about motherhood, and this magazine wants something experimental. I'm going to tailor my work so that it fits all those different criteria. And I think that's also great. The question is really, what are your goals as a writer? Are you trying to put together a book? Are you trying to finish a novel? And where do you see your own path taking you, and how can you get there? What are the steps that you need to take to get there? So I don't think it's wrong to tailor. From my own personal experience, I think the downfall of tailoring your work to meet lit mags is that it makes you a little scatterbrained. And then, because I think that's actually more my method, and a little bit problematic, because then you're like, what are you putting together? Is there a cohesive project that you're working on, or are you just trying to get published in all these different magazines, which is fine, but it may not be your long-term goal. So I think there's no right way to do it. It's all hard. None of it is easy. So I think it's really about what your goals are as a writer, and really what you can do. Like maybe you cannot for the life of you write a conventional story. Like you're not wired that way. And so don't worry about it.
I think similarly, people ask about contests, should we try for contests? Should we not try? And I think if you are going to try for a contest, I mean, the insider knowledge that I've been given, and I wonder, Becky, if you've heard the same, is that you should send your work in the beginning of the contest, that you have better chances in the beginning than later on. But also you're paying someone, to publish their work. I mean, some contests, I believe Missouri is this way. They'll consider, something you send to the contest is also being considered for general submissions too. So you're sort of getting a couple bang for your buck, but it is also a substantial, financial contribution. And is that something, you feel, is worthwhile? I mean, you can view that contribution, $20, sometimes even more than that you're paying for contest entry, as like a donation to the magazine, and saying like, this is a magazine I believe in. I'm giving you $20 for your, for your magazine, and also for, to enter this contest. But it's just, another way of thinking about like, where do you submit, and why, and how do you make those decisions?
Yeah. We have another question. This is a great question from Diamond. Do you have any general advice for anyone starting out in the writing industry? Like do's and do nots, any advice would be helpful. So what did you do, Jen, when you were starting out?
When I was starting, I just wrote, I wrote as much as I could, and I tried to create, before I was in graduate school, I tried actually to get a job where I could have Fridays to write, and have one day where I really, threw myself into it. And I think right, finding community, which you can find in a variety of ways, taking a class, or just, joining Twitter, or, like just feeling, I think the more you can develop your identity and sort of own yourself as a writer, published or not, teaching or not, all this other stuff, but just really feeling part of this world, I think is important. You can take classes if that is something that, if you're ready for feedback. But I think really, I guess it's a question more, about writing or about publishing, but I think not to get too hung up on publishing. I mean, I was sort of very lucky that early on, when I was like, oh, I'm going to apply to graduate school, I think I should have some publishing credits under my name, before I'm going to send this one thing out to a bunch of places. And I ended up like placing in a Glimmer Train contest, which like,
Wow.
really lucky, right? I mean, I think I tried many times after that and never placed again,
You're dating yourself though, because Glimmer Train is closed now.
I know, like long closed.
I have that. I have a Glimmer Train contest honorable mention, and then they closed like the next year. I was like, I finally got something from Glimmer Train, and now they're closed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think focusing too much on publishing early on is because publishing, it's expensive. You often have to pay money, and it's time consuming. And then you have this like up and down feeling like, am I being rejected? Am I bad? Am I, and I just think you just want to put that away and just like, just immerse yourself in what you love about the writing,
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, I think that all is exactly right. I mean, it's a question of what kind of writer are you, what do you need at this particular moment? I think no one really knows what they're doing. That has always been my belief. And I think, MFAs sort of offer some like a structure and a feeling of kind of concrete achievement, but really, writing is very exploratory, and it's very, you're discovering, you're making the path as you go, and it's you just kind of have to. It's hard to give advice about the writing in general. I think if you love it and you're hungry for it and you're passionate for it, you just as Jenn said, just write and just write and just write, and you'll see things kind of coming to you through that.
One other thing I would mention when you're first getting interested in publishing is the best thing you can do is work for a literary magazine as a volunteer reader. So a volunteer reader is typically when you submit you send your work out to a literary magazine, the managing editor sees it, and then they assign it to readers. And usually, and not all magazines are this way, some rely on like a university and they have a class, and the class are all the readers, or there are different structures of the process, but a reader is just a first line person who will read the work, evaluate it, and decide if it should be promoted or rejected. And this is such an excellent education. I did this when I actually finished my MFA, and you learn what are the cliches, like how many times can I read like this story structure, like what is coming in over and over again, and like not really, it's not seeming new, right? And you see that both with I was a reader for fiction at the time, and so you see both the content, but you also see the cover letters. And the cover letters, I think, there's something that like makes writers a little bit crazy, right? Because you're like, oh, I have to introduce myself, I want to do it the right way, and mostly they really don't matter very much at all, but you get a real sense for like what a cover letter should and shouldn't do. And I feel like all those concerns I had, like I'm not concerned at all about it. I mean, the main idea being, you just don't want to be arrogant, in your cover letter. Like you really just want to be straightforward. And my favorite cover letter I ever received was this, like, dear whomever, here is my story title. I thought you might want to give it a look. That was the whole cover letter. And I just thought, like, all right, this person hasn't been published. They're not trying to convince me of anything. They're not quoting their past professors. They're not showing me, excerpts of magazines that said stuff about their novel, like none of that stuff. They're not telling me about this side career that has nothing to do with writing. They're just like, here it is. That's all I got to say, and I thought there was real power in it.
I love that. So we have another question here. Doesn't it come down to submitting to the lit mag that best fits your work? Do you want to address that? So how How important is it that writers find the magazines that are right for their work, and maybe a little bit of how do they do that? How do you find that magazine?
Sure. I mean, I teach classes on this, as I think you do too, right?
Mhm.
You know, about how to find the right home for your writing, and you know, it's ideally you can read the literary magazines, you can read interviews with you can watch interviews with the editors, like the ones that you do. You can read reviews of the literary magazines. Like there are a variety of ways of doing it. I actually one of the classes that I've taught a couple of years is what I call like the unwritten submission guidelines, right? You like we read their submission guidelines, and so many of them for different literary magazines read the same, right?
Mhm.
You know, maybe they're more interested in speculative versus realism, or but they're like, we write, we publish the best writers, right? Everyone publishes the best writers, right? But I feel like there are tastes, right? There are these like difference in styles of different literary magazines, and I don't think that editors know or can describe it, and I don't necessarily think it's their job to. So I would teach this class where I would look really carefully at a bunch of different literary magazines, and I looked at all these different aspects. I actually wrote this down so I wouldn't forget in case I mentioned it. So I would look at like the tone and the pacing, the genre, is it genre material? What subject matters are they interested
Mm.
in? What's the narrative style? Is it like, do they tend to be more linear or non-linear? And then I would look at also this term that I have coined myself as the starter or the closer, meaning does it start strong or does it end strong? So just to kind of get general sense for the
Mhm.
magazine. And of course, there's always variation, not all of them are going to be in present tense, but you can get a sense for like, okay, let me extract out this information and see like, what are you really publishing? And so when I do this for classes, like editors afterwards will be like, can you tell me? Like,
I was just thinking that, can you publish this somewhere? Can you publish your notes on LitMags? This is really amazing.
I thought of this, and but the thing is that lit mags are always changing, right? You're always getting new editors in. If it's a lit mag that uses students, like different students will shift it. So I feel like you have to be really careful when you're making a generalization about a lit mag, and I would have to keep updating it on a regular basis. So I was like it's a huge amount of work when I do this.
Mhm.
And so I haven't published it anywhere, and I haven't done it in a couple of years. So even what I have is super outdated at this point. Um, but yeah, but I think it is tricky to find, what's the best, writing, the best home for your writing. And really you can just, read as much of the magazines, or maybe just a paragraph or here or there, just get a sense for the sensibility. But actually one thing I'll say, I mentioned this in the beginning, that I spoke to a couple of editors and asked them if they had any advice for you.
Yes.
And one thing that, Carolyn Kubler of the New England Review had said something that is related to this. My question to her were like, what are general misconceptions about literary journals, or what do writers kind of get wrong about them? And she said this, she said, people aren't familiar with the New England Review, and magazines like ours sometimes assume that because it's been around for a few decades and is published at a college, it might be a bit dry, stale, or staid. But in fact, the opposite is true. Just open it and read. Because we're not a commercial venture, we're able to take a chance on new writing that is striking for any number of reasons, that doesn't fit any established convention, and that you won't find anywhere else. And she said, it doesn't have to be necessarily you read the New England Review and think, oh, this is just like my poem. This is just like, but really, am I really into what they're publishing? Then they might be
Mhm.
really into what I'm doing, even if it's not something I've seen in their pages yet. So
Mhm.
they're particularly interested in that approach.
Mhm. That's a really good one, because I make the same sort of assumption, like the certain magazines that are tied to universities, they've been around since
Mhm.
1890, and I just sort of assume that they're going to be more serious and kind of heavy, and traditional. And then you open it up and it's not like that at all.
Mhm.
So again, it's another plug for Journal of the Month, because it allows people to actually get their hands on the magazine, because you're not going to see it otherwise. You're not, I mean, unless you order a back issue of Hudson Review, you're probably not going to see it at Barnes and Noble. You're probably not going to see it at your local bookstore. So it's just a great way to actually get your hands on a variety of magazines and see what they're actually doing.
Thanks.
Yeah. So what else? You mentioned yesterday you got some juicy tidbits from New England Review, Bellevue Literary Review. Do tell. What did they have to say?
So yeah, so I got feedback from Evelyn Rogers from the Missouri Review, and then Carolyn from New England Review, and Stacy Bodziak from the Bellevue Literary Review. Let's see, what else can I share? Okay, so more about misconceptions about journals or what writers get wrong. So the Missouri Review said they do read cover letters before they read the material because they find that a useful intro, but they aren't swayed by credentials. They also said, Evelyn also said, we're generally reading to discover and find, not to reject. But the reality is that we receive many more submissions than we can publish. And there are many that we would love to publish if there were just more room and staff and funds to do it. And then I heard this, she shared this really great story about this summer, they're going to publish a writer who's been submitting work consistently to them since the 90s. Since she was like in graduate school. So that is a long time to be submitting work. But she said this happens all the time, and that if if and when you get rejections, knowing it's not this piece at this time, but how great that this writer didn't give up, and realize this is going to be my home when I find the right work.
Was this the Missouri Review?
This is the Missouri Review.
Yeah, I think that's been something that's really surprised me in talking to the editors is how much they say, just submit again, because some of their guidelines say things like, don't try, like wait 6 months before trying us again. And I think, at least when I see something like that, it makes me feel like they don't want you to actually submit again at all. That they're sending you a message, like if you get a rejection, like wait a while, wink, wink, meaning we don't ever want to hear from you again. Like that's kind of how I've taken it. And then just talking to all these editors and realizing, no, they actually like, please try us again. Just keep trying. Like maybe not every time you have a story, not every 2 months, but just send your work and we want it and we're rooting for you. I think that's a really important takeaway for writers, that the editors are rooting for you and they want you to do well and they want it to be a good fit.
And we are their bread and butter. They are nothing without us, and I had an experience at a writing conference a couple of years ago, 10 years ago, that where you meet agents, and I feel like it's a great analog. In many other environments you'll meet agents and they'll be like, it feels like they have all the power, but at this writing conference, because it was so prestigious, they treat you like they don't want to mess things up with you. Like, they're nice and they're really, they really want to know you because you could be the next whomever. And I just thought everyone should always treat us that way.
Was this bread loaf?
It was, yeah. And but I think it's true, and I think it's just particularly with the pandemic, editors are overwhelmed. They've received so many more submissions than really easily handle and are set up to handle. And I think in journals, before the pandemic, it would take 6 months for them to respond. And now there's even more so. So I think there is like a real problem of, how do we manage all these submissions? And I've also feel like I've seen that editors are becoming more inventive too about managing it. I think that Cincinnati Review, you were talking to Lisa about, one of your interviews about how they're managing it. And they're just, and I've seen other magazines do the same thing. They're just opening really narrow windows of submissions. So it's just, we'll open it and then they'll close once they have enough. I think that's a really smart way to approach it. Then they're actually getting through their queue in a reasonable, and what I feel is a respectful amount of time. To writers, as opposed to, sure, we'll open it up for, 8 months and you may not hear from us for over a year, which feels a little less considerate, I think, and also must be more overwhelming to them,
Yeah, I agree. And because then they're not even really reading the submission carefully necessarily.
Or they're just taking so much time. I would say also I'll add a little more on that same question about misconceptions. So the Bellevue Literary Review, so they also encourage new writers. And for them, they don't see the cover letters till after they read the work. the creative work, and they see that as a way of leveling the playing field. They want, emerging writers to be up there, just with widely published writers. And then one thing they said that writers sometimes get wrong is they see submission guidelines as like, optional, and really to be read and respected. And I think it would make their, submissions queues smaller and more able to address the people who are submitting work that's really within their theme. For them is health and wellness, like that's really their focus. So I can give you more quotes, but it looks like there are other chat questions.
I just wanted to jump in. Yeah, actually, there's a question from Mary. Is this true even if it's only a form letter rejection? Meaning, should you keep submitting even if it's a form letter rejection? And I would say yes, absolutely. In talking to editors, yes, sometimes they send form rejections. I myself have gotten form rejection after form rejection, and then suddenly an acceptance. So I think writers need to know, and this is certainly something that I have felt as a writer, that if they're rejecting you, it means you're put on a blacklist. They're all laughing at you and saying, why is this writer sending their work to us again? We don't, that's not happening. They're just, oh, the story, it's not the right one for our magazine. Thanks for trying. Rejection. It's not personal. There in many instances, the higher up editors aren't even seeing your name. It's the initial readers that might be screening it. So yes, if you get a form rejection, toss it away, delete it, print it out and paste it up on your wall, whatever your ritual is, whatever you need to do. But then if you want to get into that magazine, keep sending to that magazine. I do think it's worth, sorry, did you want to add something to that?
I wanted to add also, something else is that you don't always know what a form rejection is, and so one thing I would always do is check Rejection Wiki, which is a site online which has people list the different rejections, because there are different tiers of rejections. There's kind of a standard rejection, but then there's like an encouraging rejection, which is a little bit more like, please send us your work again. And it's also a form. And it's very easy to look at that and think, oh, they're sending that to everyone, but in fact, a much smaller pool. We need to grab that encouragement wherever it is.
Absolutely.
So to look at there.
Yeah, and I want to say, I do think that it's worth, if you are getting a lot of form rejections from a magazine, it is worth making sure that is the right magazine for you, because you may be submitting to the magazine because it's prestigious, because it's competitive, you've heard great things about it, but then when you actually look at it, you realize, oh, this is why I've been rejected. They want stuff about, horseback riding, and I've been sending them my cat story, obviously, so make sure that it is the right market for you. But otherwise, if you love the magazine, if you feel like your work is a good fit for that magazine, I would say, yes, keep submitting. And just a very personal anecdote, I've been submitting to Agni, I don't know. I didn't get some acceptance, but I just 2 weeks ago got an encouraging rejection from them. And it was so funny because I've been getting rejections from them for maybe decade, like for so long. And I actually thought this was a magazine that is definitely not reading the work. Like they're just not, they're they get stuff from Jimpala here. They get they're not reading little old emerging, right? And then suddenly there was this actually encouraging rejection. So this is just like a personal anecdote to illustrate, yes, you can keep getting those form rejections, and then one day something just clicks and you get an encouraging rejection instead of a form rejection.
I think that's a great point. And I also want to point out that because editors are changing all the time, you can get a rejection from a magazine and then the staff can be gone. But also many, as we were talking about before, many journals, the first line reader is a volunteer.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's largely problematic, right? Because you have your fiction editor, your poetry editors who are higher up, and it's really should be their sensibility that's guiding the reading. But what's happening is you have these readers who are rejecting stuff early on, and then they can only, the genre editor only chooses from what gets promoted.
Mhm.
And so there might be many things that that poetry editor might have taken had they read it earlier on, but they didn't get to see it. So if you're getting that flat out rejection from a reader who, may not be there in 6 months, or maybe obviously has flawed, opinions, because I mean, you just don't know. And I
Mhm.
would say, one of the things that I like personally, actually, I think Agni, I think I really like their process, their submissions process. And I think it's or I should say the one that I'd heard about, it's possible it's changed since I'd heard about it probably about 10 years ago. But their senior editor is the first reader for the stuff that comes in. So
Really?
he reads he doesn't read the entire work,
Mhm.
but he reads part of it. And then if he likes it, he sends it to the readers. And
Huh.
then if they like it, it comes back to him, and then he reads the entire work. But which I think is a much smarter way to have his readers
Right.
governing the entire process, as opposed to, I think it's more efficient I mean, probably not for him. I mean, he's got a lot on his plate, but I think for the overall vision of the journal, I would imagine
Mhm.
it's more cohesive.
Mhm. Mhm.
But
Absolutely.
congratulations to you.
Thanks. And we have a question from Catherine. How do editors really feel about simultaneous submissions? Can it be seen as a negative?
I mean, I think that's one you'd have to ask individual editors, because every
Mhm.
editor is going to have a different opinion. I mean, I know like Three Penny Review is like
Oh, yeah.
shockingly amazing journal, right? They say no simultaneous submissions. Georgia Review used to also say that. I don't know if they still do.
Yeah.
But Three Penny Review will get back to you within a week,
Mhm.
and so they can really stand behind that. I mean, the generalization I'll make is that, the people who are running literary magazines are themselves writers. Most of them are, right? And so they know what it's like submitting work out,
Mhm.
and they know that it's a ridiculous game to not simultaneously submit. So I think some will certainly, be against it, but I think it's hard to separate my own very strong opinion from what I believe editors do. I mean, I know like the Sun has, it's interesting, we submitted to the Sun because they're like, we accept simultaneous submissions, but we discourage it. Have you simultaneously submitted? Which
Yeah.
is a daunting checkbox, and you're like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen if I check the checkbox? I mean, I think we just have to take them at face value,
Yeah.
right? If they're letting you do it, they're letting you do it, and you just
Mhm.
go from there.
I completely agree. And there are some of these magazines, it's a little weird where they say they accept it, but they discourage it. And you don't know, does that mean it's like a strike against you if you're simultaneously submitting? But I think most magazines allow it. And I think it has to be fine. I mean, if a magazine is going to take 8 months to get back to you, then you have to be sending your work to multiple places. Like it's just the way it is.
I also wanted to say, before I started Journal of the Month, this is my second literary entrepreneurial project. And
Mm.
I had started this because I worked at a literary magazine. I started this site called Pelletsland, which is long, long, long gone.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, yeah. I started it for this exact same reason, because I thought
Yeah.
it was very strange. Writers are submitting your work. You submit it to 20 different places. And yet each one, the submissions are treated as if, each journal is separate, but they're interrelated, and so my idea, and, this is how we built Tell It Slant, was that the journals that we worked with, if you submitted to all the journals we worked with, and it was accepted by one, it was automatically removed from the queue of the others with a polite note that said basically, haha, you missed your chance, and like let the editors know, okay,
Mhm.
you were kind of too slow, but also it's just, that whole please let us know if it's accepted elsewhere. Well, we took care of that for you,
Mm.
so there wasn't this unnecessary bloat. And yes, I think that treating us like a community is
Yeah.
the way to proceed.
Yeah. And we have a related question, but I also, Anne's comment, if anyone thanks me for my bravery in sending my words into the world, I will scream. And yeah, I've heard that a lot. Sometimes I think editors don't quite hit the mark in their rejection letters. I do believe editors, when they say they hate sending rejection letters, I think it's really not fun to be rejecting writers as much as sometimes I think they're all like in their cloistered rooms going, no, 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 and sort of, enjoying their power. But I don't think that is what's going on at all. I think they actually really hate, sending rejection letters to writers, because it's heartbreaking for writers and nobody wants to be in that position. But I agree with you, Anne. I think some of these rejection letters, they're just, they don't hit the mark. They're a little off. They can read as condescending or annoying or whatever. But, again, you just delete it, move on. You come up with a system. Maybe you send 5 new pieces out for every 1 rejection that you get, and there you go. So we have a question from Jenna. How do you handle withdrawing or not withdrawing a piece from everywhere you have it out to if one okay, this is interesting. So if a publication asks for revision, how do you handle withdrawing your piece from other magazines?
I would not withdraw it until it's been accepted, because just because you've been, it's wonderful that you've been invited, to revise and to submit again, but it's not yet been accepted, so I would just leave the others in play, and you work on your revision, you send it into them, and if it's accepted, wonderful, and then you withdraw from other places. But otherwise, I think it's just until you have that final yes, just assume it's still a work in progress.
I agree with that. I heard from a friend recently who she entered a contest, and I'm curious what you think about this. And the editors told her that it was on the short list, and they asked her to withdraw it from other magazines. That seemed pretty shady to me. I think you should not be withdrawing your work from magazines until you have an absolute firm yes, until that light is green on submittable, it says accepted. Even, maybe until you have a contract with the magazine, if you want to be a real stickler about it. But I think you should not. It's so hard. It's so hard to get published, and you just don't want to put yourself into a disadvantageous position ever. So until you have confirmation from a magazine, yes, they're definitely publishing, they want it. I don't think you should withdraw it from other places at all.
Yeah, I would send a follow-up question and just say, are you saying that if it doesn't place in this contest, that it will be published in this magazine? Because that might be sort of what they are thinking.
Right.
That it's not, this is ours, but they don't feel comfortable saying that, or they're not exactly saying that. But that's what I would read between the lines of that.
Yeah.
I also wouldn't. It doesn't really seem fair to a writer.
Yeah. So were there more? Did we go through the whole list of juicy inside tips from editors?
You did not. I have more. So one of area of particular interest for me is racial equity within literary magazines, and I have written about this, and I'd like to see what efforts magazines are making to sort of level the playing field, and I feel like it's important for a person in my role to just keep asking that question every time. Also, it makes editors maybe think about the importance of that as well. I mean, I think they're doing it anyway. It's not like I'm introducing this idea, but I think that just constantly asking is important. So I asked them, and so Stacy at Bellevue said that one of the things they've done is they are having more diversity in their editorial and executive board. And they're also working more with outreach groups. They're outreaching to writing groups, community groups, colleges, college programs, and prisons. And that they've actually particularly been sending out more copies of their journal to prisons, and they've noticed they're getting more submissions from inmates. And they also continue to accept paper submissions, which is a way that inmates, and then also people who are unable to use computers or uncomfortable using them, can still continue to submit, and so that kind of widens their equity lens, who can submit to the journal. The New England Review said that they view racial equity in particular, it's not a problem with a solution, but a continuous outreach to actionable anti-racist steps. So they've been having anti-bias trainings of their staff, and they're focusing on publishing accountability by having internal audits of the diversity in their pages, using data to create benchmarks. So trying to, kind of monitor and make changes in who's being published. And Missouri said they're always having internal discussions and reviewing their published content. But they're focusing a lot on their website to make sure that writers can see, a range of voices and artists in the content and the prize winners, because they're like, this is our face, and we want to make sure it includes, a variety of folks. And then just kind of some other tidbits that I've noticed is that there are journals that are now having BIPOC only submission periods. And I would be really interested to hear from those editors about how that's shifting, who's in the journal. I noticed that The Common has done that, and then Echo Tone did that this summer in a really interesting way. Like, I think their only submissions period, perhaps for the year, was like 3 weeks. I think it was in August or early September. It was August, of 3 weeks that are only for BIPOC individuals, and then like 5 days for non-BIPOC individuals. And I thought that was really interesting, because many journals are, asking writers to self-identify. They'll say, let us know in cover letters, which can be awkward, and or it sort of puts the onus on the writer, as opposed to the journal saying, like, this is your time. And I think writers are more likely to take advantage of that. I know that, like, Shenandoah, they have a fellowship for BIPOC editors, so they're mentoring and bringing in BIPOC editors. So I thought that was encouraging and interesting to see. I also was recently on a Facebook group that I'm part of editors. There was one editor who brought up, having non-paid submissions for BIPOC individuals, and what journals are doing that, and so
I've been seeing a lot of that.
I think then do you want to go to another question, or should I?
Sure. Okay. We have a question here from Daniel, and it's related to resubmitting to a magazine. So should you resubmit a revised piece to the same journal? Conventional wisdom says no, but are there exceptions to this? And could doing this get you remembered in a bad way?
Well, it's a risk. I mean, particularly if the editorial board is the same. But I think if you let a certain amount of time go by, realistically, it seems very unlikely, right, that the editors would notice, right, because there's readers or something, but at the same time, they ask you not to do it, and there is such a huge submissions queue, and there's so many literary magazines out there also. So I guess I would be really judicious about doing it. If you're like, no, this journal is going to, if you're really dead set on this journal, I maybe wait a few years and try it. But mostly I would not do that. I would look elsewhere.
I would agree with that, unless it's a really substantial revision. If they've sent you a form rejection, or even a rejection that says this piece isn't right for us, please try us again, and you want to resubmit that same story, I think the revision has to be really strong, really like taking the piece apart and redoing it, and in some ways just very different from the first, if not completely unrecognizable from the first, because I don't see the point. I mean, I think if the editors wanted it, and if they felt that this piece was close enough and it just needed some changes, they would have taken it. But they didn't take it suggests to me that it's just not the right piece. So revise it, make it stronger, and then there's so many lit mags that you could send it to that I don't think you need to fixate on that one.
I would also add that, when I was a reader, my experience of being a reader is that the vast majority of what I read, like, there's a couple things that, there's some percentage, right? Maybe, 10% that's like just really bad, right? Just bad writing, right? This person didn't really take it seriously, right? Then there's some percentage that you're like totally wrong, for the market, like, this is sci-fi and we only do realistic, whatever, really just totally wrong. But they're like, the vast majority of what I read was so close, like, it was really close. Like, you'd be like, this just needs a new ending. This just needs a new, but even being that close, those people are still largely getting that same form rejection, So to like underscore that point, that it has to be such a substantial rewrite and be such a different if it really was just almost there, like, it's just not, that's not kind of good enough to get the attention.
Yeah.
Years.
But I also want to address the second part of this question, because and could doing this get you remembered in a bad way? And I just want to assure everyone and assure writers in general that the things that get you remembered in a bad way among editors are really bad things. It's being rude, it's replying to a rejection letter, just being like an asshole, basically, sending in a story that's racist or that's violent, not following submission guidelines, just generally being loud and noticeable and obnoxious. I think sending a story in and then sending in a revised version of that story, they're just, they're going to be kind of a note like still not right for us, but I don't think they're going to put your name on a list and, have you, in the back of their minds that this is a person that we will never ever publish. It's just sort of you're not following what they want you to, you're not following the guidelines as maybe they want you to be, but they're not gonna hold any grudges from talking to editors. I mean, I think the stuff that editors, I once there's a writer named Don Lee. He's now the editor of Tinge magazine, which is a great online magazine. He used to be the editor of Plowshares. And when I was doing the review, he wrote this great piece about what editors have to deal with. And I know as writers were thinking like, oh, woe is me, what editors have to deal with. But really some of it, like he said, he got hate mail written in purple crayon. He said somebody left a bag of turd in front of his office door. So there's so many things that writers do that will get you remembered by editors. And it's good to keep in mind, like, if you're just politely submitting story after story, that's not that bad. The stuff that goes on, it can be really obnoxious and bad. So don't worry too much about what you're doing.
I think, and to that end, I also had, like, when I was working as a reader in particular, I remember being surprised by how tolerant the editors were. They send these like strong messages like, don't do this, don't do that, and I remember there was one, like, you're only supposed to submit, one time within the reading period. And I remember there was one writer who, like, I would read, get a couple batches a month, of journal of stories to read. And I was often reading his work. And I was like, he's not even waiting for his rejections. Like, this guy is sending constantly. And I said something to the editor, like, I'm on the side of the writers, but I was like, this guy is really, really not like, and that's just my batch, right? There's many other readers. And she was like, oh, I know, but he's getting better. I noticed he's getting, I'm just,
oh, that's really sweet.
It really was. And this is not an editor who has a reputation for being like a big softie, like, I just, like, they do want us to succeed too.
Yeah.
But I think they have to somehow guard their time.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So there's a question, do editors welcome getting thank you letters from rejected writers?
I don't know. I mean, I think if it's polite and it's short, who doesn't,
Yeah.
I don't know that it makes a difference, but yeah, I can't really answer that. Becky, can you?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think what I see on Twitter a lot, when I hear from editors, the thing that really stands out for them is people get very mad about rejection letters. And this actually makes it harder for other writers, because I think sometimes editors try to be nice and give a detailed rejection of why a piece was not right for the magazine. And then writers get really angry at the editors for that feedback. And so then that makes it harder for other writers, because some writers really do want feedback. So I think because of this, a lot of editors have just adopted this policy of, we're not going to give any feedback to any writers because it's not worth it, because some of them just get so angry about it. So there are a lot of writers that are doing kind of uncool stuff, just being, hostile and, aggressive. And so yeah, I would think editors would love to get a thank you, a nice, polite thank you. I appreciate this. They probably won't respond, and it's not going to do you any favors. They'll just think, oh, you're a nice person. But I don't think it's going to make it any easier to publish your next story. If you want to say thank you, that's fine. I don't think it's going to hurt. But it's, it's not necessary. And I think the main thing is just to focus on your own work and trying to get your work out someplace that you want it to be published.
Yeah, and to find a way to feel good about it. I mean, I do that sometimes. I send thank you notes for rejections. I think it gives me personal closure, it makes me feel like received. I appreciate it. We have this relationship. I
love you.
Non-purple crayon. But yeah, I think and it may end up getting, bounced back anyway, because you might, so I think it's mostly either positive or neutral.
Yeah. Okay, so did you have more with your list? We got
then my last of my list is changes prompted by the pandemic. What will stay and what won't. So as you would expect, students and staff had to correspond remotely. So they all kind of mentioned that. New England Review said submissions increased significantly, and this is definitely something I've heard from a variety of places. Missouri said they also saw big increases. They lost some of their typical funding, but gained grant emergency support. So that sort of shifted things a little bit within them. They also developed Zoom events, such as a Meet the Editors for entrance in the Perkoff Prize contest and the Jeffrey E. Smith contest. So these were successful, small, intimate conversations with the editors for people who had submitted. And they were surprised that more people didn't take advantage of that opportunity. And I think, hearing about that makes me, as a writer, more interested in submitting to a contest, to know that there are kind of more things that I would be getting out of it in addition to supporting the magazine. So I wanted to share that. And Bellevue said they became an independent lit mag. So they used to be affiliated with, I believe it was NYU Medical School. And they developed virtual events that now will become stable. I think that'll be really interesting to see how many, virtual events will now just become part of the journals, what they offer. Those are my best tidbits.
That's great. Thank you for reaching out to them.
Sure.
So we're past an hour, but I wanted to ask you two things. The first, nothing scary. Do you have advice for people who are thinking about starting some kind of literary side project? If it's maybe starting a literary magazine, maybe starting, I don't know, any number of things. Since you've done this twice now, so what advice would you offer people?
I will offer advice to you that Jenny Barber, who used to be the editor of Salamander when I first started, and she had said that she felt that the literary world is especially open to literary entrepreneurship in a variety of ways, and I would definitely agree. I mean, it's amazing how many editors really took a chance on me, especially when I first started Pelletsland, which was a submission site, and I was like, I'm going to create software that will manage your submissions for you, and my model had been, I was giving it to the journals for free, and then writers would pay when they submitted. And so I'm like, so I'm giving you something free, and it's going to be your bread and butter, and I'm going to manage it. What do you think? And they did it, and I was like, wow, you don't know anything about me. I'm managing credit cards for you. And I mean, my husband has a software background, and, so like we did it, and it was a great site. And, but I was really surprised, how many, just how open they were to new ideas. And I think we clearly need more literary magazines, because you see these submission queues are, so bloated. Like we need, and I think there are many ways to, as I said before, engage in the literary community. And I think it's really great to find your way. That said, it's a big time sink, and then they're different. The skills that draw you to be a writer are not necessarily the same skills that draw you to be a literary entrepreneur, and a successful one too. But it's a really interesting, an interesting world. What do you think, Becky? How do you answer that?
So I just saw a question that said, will this recording be available after we end? And I just want to say, yes, it will be. So, and if those that don't know, this is for, I have a Substack, litmagnews.substack.com, and that's where, and Jen will share it too. We'll share the video after, but that's where the video will be posted. But yeah, so advice for people starting side projects. I think it's a great thing to do. I really do. I mean, I think there's so much hunger to connect when you're, for me, my experience was that as a writer, I was so hungry to connect, but my own writing was not where it should be in order to get the publications that would like consistent publications enough that you feel like you're making those connections. So having a kind of literary side project was like this nice outlet and a nice way that I could connect to people, connect to an audience, connect to other writers, connect to editors during a time where my own writing still needed to kind of gestate a little longer because the publishing process is so slow, as we all know, and your own growth as a writer takes such a long time. And sometimes you're ready intellectually and emotionally to be reaching out to the literary community, and you want something else to offer or some other way to connect with them. And so for me, that having the review and then now my newsletter, it's a really useful way to connect with the literary world while my writing is still kind of germinating and growing. But as Jen said, it's a lot of work. And I think a lot of people tend to take these projects on in their 20s. My theory is all these literary magazines get born when people are in their 20s and they're coming out of MFA programs. And then they have kids and they're like, I can't do this anymore. That's when all the lit mags fold. Or a lot of lit mags anyway. But yeah, I think it's a great thing to do. And I think I guess my advice would be to stop when you're not enjoying it anymore. And that's for me, that's when with the review, I kind of hit a wall where I felt like I was doing too much emailing, too much kind of back-end website stuff it wasn't feeding me creatively anymore. And I think when you get to that point, then just stop, and call your project a success and congratulate yourself for trying, but don't push it past the point of where it's interfering with your own creative work and your other jobs and your family life and all that stuff. So, if you stop enjoying it, stop doing it.
This is great advice. I mean, I feel like this is advice I maybe need to take. But I also want to say too that it, so much about writing, like there isn't, like it's easy to feel like you don't have agency. You have this idea that's percolating. You revise, you start again. It's like it's such a non-linear process that can feel like you're in it, you're working it, but you don't really have a vision. Like it's easy to not feel successful. I always talk about that. Like I have my writing days and then I have the days when I do like my other work and I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel like I got something done on my other days. The writing days, you're like, I rewrote several pages and I will rewrite them again tomorrow. It's a hard space. It can be a hard space to, for a person of like my neurology to be in, all the time. And I think these side projects, it just really gives you a part of this world that you control, and you have agency in, and you can build and you can grow and you can really like, you aren't at the mercy of publishing or at the mercy of your, irritating characters who are not doing what you want them to do, whatever. It's just, so I think that you can't kind of overstate what the value is there. And I think pulling out is very tricky, but I think your advice is good.
Yeah. And then my other question was if you have submitting advice for writers who are just maybe new to this, maybe sort of have a few publications already, but generally just don't know how to keep going or where to look. What advice would you offer them?
It's a very weird world right now with submitting. I think because, as I mentioned, journals are really overrun, that many journals that would have like bigger submission periods, are now like, okay, well, submissions will reopen, on February 15th. And then you get to February 15th and they're like, they'll reopen on April, whatever. Or they're like, they're not opening at all, so it's a strange world to kind of find yourself in and to know how to navigate. I mean, I think, typically summertime, many journals are not accepting submissions, although some really are, you know.
Mhm.
It's another thing, like there's just like these kind of generalizations about when the dark periods have shifted also. And, you know,
Mm.
journals are kind of doing things all their own way. So I think when you have something, you just submit it to a large variety of places,
Mhm.
and how you find where to submit it to. You know, you can find open markets, like for example, on your newsletter, Bullet Mag News Roundup newsletter. Like I don't, you know, and that's a question I have for you. I mean, I know we want to end, but how you find, you know, so many resources. But I think
Mm.
it's a great way, because you often have in your newsletter, you know, these markets that are open in, you know, January, or, you know, you like, so that's a really easy way for someone to go and find, as opposed to, you know, joining Duotrope, which is a website that you have to pay to join, but you can, it's like a large database and you can use it to find open markets or various others, you know, or looking through, you know, Poets and Writers website. You know, there's like a variety of places that you can look at to find open markets, but even that stuff I feel like is constantly changing. So so I think looking at like your newsletter, I think is really a really great way to find out exactly what is open and will be open now, as you need it.
And I said 2 questions, but actually one more question, final. Words of morale for writers who are submitting.
We're in this together, you know. We are, you know. I think your biggest competition is yourself, right?
Mm.
And that's how you by keeping to writing, you win, right? Because you are better today than you were a month ago, right?
Mhm.
And that's who you're competing with to become your best self. And it can feel like, no, actually I'm competing with like all the people in that queue. You know?
All the people in my MFA program.
Right, exactly. The ones who are getting published, you know, but they're not your competition. They're your comrades, right?
Mm.
They're the people who you're writing. What you're writing is in conversation with what they're writing. You know, you're
Mhm.
a response. It's a call and response, or that's how I like to think
Mm.
about
I
it.
love that.
And you want to stay engaging, and you want to publish, and then someone else will be call and response to you. You know, and that's,
Mhm.
I think I think that's like, you just want to stay in this world and find your place. You know, however it is, as a
Mhm.
reader, as a writer, you know, attending conferences, like you find your inspiration and stay with it as long as it's giving back to you.
Mhm. Mhm. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Jen. I feel like we could go on for another 3 hours, but people want lunch and have other things to do. But this was really great. So thank you, and thank you everyone for coming out today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to see you. Yeah, thanks for this opportunity.